أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله.
Assalamu alaikum, peace be unto you. We're back for another episode of Islam in Focus. I'm your host, Hamid Rashid. Today we're having our 19th program in our series dealing with the sources of the Quran. We'll be discussing the Quran in modern science. I have joining me as usual on the program Dr. Jamal Badawi of St. Mary's University. Brother Jamal, Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Could I have you very quickly highlight the main points that we touched on last week?
Okay, last week we continued to examine some of the natural phenomena which was discovered by science only hundreds of years after the Quran was revealed. More specifically, we talked about the role of mountains in stabilizing the earth crust, that they acted as stakes, as the Quran refers to it. We talked about the movements of the shadow and how the Quran makes a clear reference to the rotation of the earth. We talked briefly also about the undersea waves, something that wasn't known that clearly, being layers upon layers. Some discussion also took place with respect to the vegetation kingdom, more specifically on the ecological balance, the process of fertilization in plants, and the process of germination or the splitting of the seed when they are placed in the soil. We mentioned also something pertaining to the animal kingdom and what the Quran frequently refers to, especially in reference to the animals living in communities, as it appears, for example, in Surah 6 in the Quran. And we indicated that hundreds of years before the systematic observation and analysis of animal behavior, the Quran was speaking about this amazing phenomena. We tried to give a few examples of what the Quran mentioned, and again, in the light of our modern understanding, particularly with respect to the bees and the spider, the ants, and the organization in their community. And we said basically that all of these are just additional illustrations in addition to what was covered in previous programs, which may help answer the question as to what is the true source of the Quran. Where did it actually come from?
Mm-hmm. Well, before we move on to some discussion of human reproduction in the Quran, I'd like to examine two more areas. The first has to do with the birds.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that relates to recent discoveries that's mentioned in the Quran with respect to birds?
Yes, indeed. Actually, if you recall, in the last program, we just made a quick reference that we said that not only does the Quran speak about specific and animals in general, but also specific things have been frequently mentioned. Yes, indeed. First, it may relate to a citation that we made last time from Surah 6 in the Quran, that there is no animal that walks on earth or bird that flies with wings except that they are communities like you. We discussed last time with respect to ants and bees, and the same thing also have been observed by scientists with respect to birds, also especially when they take a journey, and there is always like a leader, and there are some certain formations, just like the formation of aircraft when they are going in some mission. It's a very amazing type of organization. But in addition to this, there is something that is quite fascinating about birds, and the Quran makes reference to that too. For example, in Surah 16 and in Surah 76, there are, in both citations, there are references to the divine order again that the birds follow. That only Allah holds them, that there's certain law or certain pattern that keep them flying and performing their functions. And in the light of modern science today, we can understand this passages more clearly now. We are told by scientists that many species of birds have a very high degree, amazing degree in fact, of programming of their movements. And this has been noted particularly in the migratory birds. And the scientists say that in the genetic code of these birds, which exist in their cells, and which is particularly active in the nervous cells, there is a complete and complex program, if you will, which guide those birds in very lengthy trips. The thing that really amazed scientists is the fact that many times small birds that never had any experience in traveling long distance or flying that long, without any guide to show them the way, they go through very lengthy and very complex trips, and they just wonder how. Even pilots sometimes with all sophisticated computers sometimes make mistakes in their navigation. So how come these small birds have all this kind of directives to follow a specific, precise path? Some scientists refer particularly to the mutton bird, which lives in the Pacific, and they say that it makes a trip that sometimes extend to 15,500 miles. So you're talking about over 15,000 miles. And it flies or makes all that trip in a specific shape, like 8. As Dr. Bouquet comment on this, he says that it is obvious then that there are detailed and complex instructions, if you will, which are found in the nervous cells of those birds. Just like we talked today about computer programming, they have a program that guides them precisely on the proper course. And all of these things the Quran has made hint to quite a long time ago.
Before we move on to the question of human reproduction, is there any other comment that you'd like to add on the animal kingdom?
Well, there's something that pertains to animal kingdom, but it relates also to the human, so perhaps that's a good connecting link between the two areas. The question of the production of the milk in mammals.
Oh, yes.
I think that's an interesting area, which applies to both, really, because the idea is basically the same. And let me start by referring to what the Quran says about that. In Surah 16, in Ayah 66 in the Quran, Allah says, وَإِنَّ لَكُمْ فِي الْأَنْعَامِ لَعِبْرَةً نُسْقِيكُم مِمَّا فِي بُطُونِهِ. There is, in animals or cattle, Allah says, there is a lesson for you. And then says, we give you to drink, that is referring to milk, of what is inside their bodies, coming from a conjunction between the contents of the intestine and the blood, a milk, pure and pleasant for those who drink it. Now, before we explain it, I think a few comments on the specific translation would be justifiable. This is the translation suggested by Maurice Bouquet. First of all, the Quran says that the initial production of that milk comes from butuniha. The word button in Arabic means bellies, but it could also mean interior of the body. It doesn't have to be the belly itself. It could mean the interior of the body. And this has been a mistake that some translator fell into and just translated automatically as bellies. Interior actually is also a proper meaning of button. Secondly, it says that this blood comes from a conjunction of farth in Arabic, and farth in Arabic means the content of the intestine. See? Some people have translated that more specifically as excrement, which is not a very accurate one, as Bouquet comments. But actually, farth also means the contents of the intestine. Now, the question here is this: how does modern science help us to understand what is the secret of that expression in the Quran that the milk comes at this conjunction between the content of the intestine and the blood? And basically, when the animal or the human eats, the food that we eat goes through a series of chemical transformation which occur along the entire digestive tract. Now, when the food substance reach the intestines, they pass through its wall. or walls, I should say, towards the what is called the systemic circulation, blood circulation. The passage of this digested food, if you will, can take place either through the portal circulation, which takes it first to the livers and then back to circulation, or it could go directly through the so-called lymphatic vessels. In other words, to put it simply, every nutrient from the digested food actually passes eventually through the bloodstream or the circulatory system. Now, how does that relate to the formation of milk? Now, the constituents of milk are in fact secreted by certain glands in the mammals, which is called mammary glands from mammals. These glands that produce that milk are actually nourished by the product of digestion. And the product of digestion, as you know, comes originally from the contents of the intestine and is carried to those glands through the blood or the bloodstream. In that sense, then we can say that the blood acts as the collector and conductor of these nutrients and taking it to the glands so that the milk eventually gets secreted or made. Now, Dr. Bouquet comments on these discoveries, and he said that these are very recent ones. They are only understood in the light of modern chemistry and the physiology of digestion. And it was, as he says, totally unknown in the 7th century of the Common Era. That's at the time of the revelation of the Quran. And that's why he says, for example, that even the notion of the circulatory system was discovered by Harvey about 1,000 years after the revelation of the Quran. And that's why he concludes in page 197 in his book, and he says, I quote, I consider that the existence in the Quran of the verse referring to these concepts, that's the formation of milk, can have no human explanation on account of the time or on account of the period in which they were formulated. It's just it's striking and unbelievable that such kind of delicate and very scientific expression appears in the Quran that early. And again, the question, where did the Quran come from?
Well, I'd like to turn now to another interesting area, and that's the area of human reproduction. Could you give us an idea of the extent of Quranic coverage on this particular subject?
Well, in fact, there are quite a few passages in the Quran that deal with human reproduction, being, of course, an important topic in itself. And for a casual observer, you would not just open the Quran and look for the chapter on human reproduction. And so the Quran is not a textbook in medicine or chemistry or anything else. It has its own style. Like many other topics in the Quran, you find the mention of any particular topic dispersed or interspersed, I should say. It comes in different contexts, in different ways of presentation, depending on the context, because the purpose behind it is different from the purpose of certain textbooks. However, we notice also that in many of the translations of the Quran, and in some cases even exegesis or commentaries, there were some lack of accuracy in conveying the meaning that is really put in the text. That's why in presenting these concepts we'll try to stop whenever is necessary to analyze the origin of the word and to make sure again that there's no problem with translation or with the commentaries which were based on the level of understanding of the commentator, but not the text necessarily of the Quran. But indeed, like I said, it's amazing to notice that the Quran has dealt with varieties of subjects that only were understood in recent decades, from the late 19th century on until our time. Some are very recent even, and that the description is very sober, even though it puts it in a simple way so that everybody can understand, but it's very sober. It's free from any of the myths and mistakes that were common at the time of the revelation of the Quran or even afterwards. And that includes a variety of things. It includes things like the formation of the sex organs, the functions of the uterus, how the uterus is protected, the process of fertilization, and the fact that both male and female contribute to the process, the embryological stages, and many other things that were not known until very late. There are a couple of very useful references to that. One is the volume that we referred to before by Dr. Maurice Bouquet, The Bible, the Quran, and Science. The other is another equally interesting book which goes into greater depth specifically on the issue of human reproduction and related to the Quran by Dr. Muhammad Al-Bar. Unfortunately still available only in Arabic. It's a beautiful book. Also it says like the creation of the human between the medicine and the Quran in Arabic. That's the meaning of the title. So both of these we will be using and referring to borrow from throughout the discussion of this topic.
Well, I wonder what was believed about embryology before recent discoveries.
Well, I'm not even going to go far back, for example, to Aristotle, who had a very strange idea that, for example, that the fetus, or the embryo, is actually formed from the menstruation blood, and that the human sperm only act as a site, like the enzyme, for example, act on the cheese or milk to make cheese, just as a catalyst. I'm not even going to go back that far, but in fact you can even refer to many of the myths about human reproduction which existed and persisted hundreds of years even after the revelation of the Quran, while the Quran actually did make correction to these things. We'll see that. But as an example of this, as Bouquet mentioned, for example, that only in 1651 did Harvey discover or make a statement which was really a very new thing in the study of embryology, when he said that all life comes initially from an egg. Dr. Al-Bar gives additional details also on that subject. I'm just trying to abstract and give some basic notions. He says that it was not until 1670, so you're talking in the 17th century, that it was discovered that there is the ovum and there is the sperm, human sperm. But even then, the scientists were not quite clear as to what role they play in the process of human reproduction. In fact, they did not even understand or realize that the sperm and the egg are both cells, just like other cells in the body, even though they are special cells, but they are cells in the body. Because the notion of cells being the biological base of the human body was not known until 1839. It was only towards the end of the 17th century, in 1694, that a theory was very common, which holds that the embryo exists in a miniature form inside the sperm. This is an illustration of that. It's just like the head of the sperm, and here is the miniature human being inside. It's amazing. In 1745, another theory which existed before re-emerged, which claimed that the sperm has no role in the formation of the embryo, not that important role. And in fact, they believe that inside the egg, not inside the sperm, inside the female egg, there is the miniature human being again, or fetus. During the 18th century, another equally strange myth, and here we talk about the 18th century, so that's the Quran was revealed in the 7th century. It says that the ovaries of Eve were supposed to be, or was supposed, Eve itself, should have had in her ovaries the seeds of all human beings, all of them, all human race, packed together, one inside the other. So it's just a process of, let's say, peeling, if you will. It was only actually towards the end of the 19th century that it was possible to actually observe how the sperm fertilizes the human egg. And if we review what the Quran says, hundreds of years before that, sometimes 1,000 years or more before these discoveries, one could not help but being really astonished. And I'm sure those who are specialists and they appreciate this, they perhaps be more astonished even than an average viewer or audience.
Well, could we turn now then to some discussion of what the Quran did have to say about human reproduction?
Well, let's take first the issue that appears in Surah 86 in the Quran, particularly in Ayah 6 and 7. It says, فَلْيَنْظُرِ الْإِنسَانُ مِمَّا خُلِقَ مِنْ مَاءٍ دَافِقٍ يَخْرُجُ مِنْ بَيْنِ الصُّلْبِ وَالتَّرَائِبِ. Which means that let the human look or examine of what is he created. He was, that is the human, fashioned from a liquid poured out which issues from between the spinal column and the ribs. Now, before explaining that, I'd like to give a couple of remarks, as I promised earlier, with respect to the wording, the translation from Arabic to English. Now, the last part of that verse, it says that the pour or the poured liquid which contribute to the fashioning of the humans comes from between the spinal column and the ribs. There are two keywords in Arabic which appear in that citation. One is sulb. And sulb is properly translated spinal cord because it's known. Aslab al-rijal, that's the spinal cord. So there's, or spine. There's no difference in that. The word tara'ib in Arabic, as Dr. Al-Bar, for example, refers and uses some of the old Arabic poetry, it does not refer only to women as some people understood, but it refers simply to ribs. Because some people misunderstood that in the past, and they mistranslated or misunderstood the ayah or the citation to mean that the human is fashioned from something that issues from the backs of men and the chests of women. And that is erroneous also on the basis of the structure of the sentence, because the text of the passage in the Quran does not say that it comes from the spine and the ribs. It says min bayn, from between. And that is why Dr. Al-Bar refers, for example, to some of the old and recent commentators on the Quran, like Al-Hasan al-Basri, one of the older commentators in the Quran, long time ago. He did not understand it like some people misunderstood it. But he said the verse says min bayn, from in between, which means that it is something that comes from in between the spinal cord and the rib of the man, and the spinal cord and the rib of the woman, which is the more appropriate to giving the structure, etymological structure of the sentence itself. Now, the question that might arise here is that according to modern science, this area between the spinal cord or spinal column and the rib is actually the area which is very crucial in the formation and nourishment of the crucial sex organs for both male and female.
Well, could I have you perhaps elaborate a little bit more on this last point? That is, what happens in this area, this region between the spine and the ribs?
Okay. Well, there are two related explanations to that. For example, in Dr. Al-Bar's book, we find a number of interesting illustrations. In one photograph, we see a comparison between the initial formation of the human or the male testicle and the female ovaries. And it can be easily seen that in the left-hand side picture or photograph, it shows the initial stages of a testicle of a male. The other one on the other side is in the ovaries of a female. Both of them are 6 weeks old. It might be noted here that both of them look almost identical. They're very similar, almost identical, I should say, and it's very difficult to really make any distinction between them, except for a specialist who can really examine it. In the second set of photographs, we have two again, and this shows the development of the human testicle of an embryo which is about 4 months old, a male. In the other pictures on the other side, we see the testicle after it has already developed at the age of 7 months. We're talking still about the fetal or the embryological stage. And in that picture, it shows clearly how the testicle at that period gets or moves to the lower abdomen. And then in this third set of pictures, we see the ovaries of a female. The first one is an ovary of a female in the 2nd month, that is in the embryological stage. The other one is on the 7th month. Again, the basic outline or the basic features of the reproductive function seem to be crystallizing in that photograph. For example, we notice here the ovaries, the fallopian tubes, and the uterus. What this means altogether really is that the crucial reproductive organs of both the male and female begin their development in the kidney region, which is the middle, between the middle of the spinal cord in the face of the lower ribs. So see the accuracy of description here, that between the spinal cord and the ribs, the lower part of the ribs and the middle of the spinal cord. And that's what exactly the Quran mentions. That's one explanation insofar as the initial formation of the testicles and the ovaries. But another equally important explanation also that explains why the passage in the Quran ties between this area and the reproductive function is the fact that even after the baby is born, when the baby starts growing, the nourishment that is received by the ovaries as well as the testicles actually comes also from the same regions, from the so-called aorta or aorta that comes again from that area. In addition to this, the nerves also that supply both the testicles and the ovaries again come from the same area, as physicians say it comes between the 11th and 12th rib. And this is again the same kind of area that the Quran refers to between the spinal cord or the spinal column and the ribs. Now, the fact that we can easily understand today, given our modern information on sciences and the embryology, that what is really meant by between the spinal cord and the rib is not much of a big deal. But definitely it is most astonishing that this reference would be made more than 1,000 years before this was even discovered.
Very striking indeed. I think we have to close off on it at this point because we're getting signals that our time for today has gone. A very interesting program. Look forward to next week's program. We want to thank you for watching. Invite you back next week. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be unto you.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله